The year was almost over. Summer was a distant memory, and winter had moved in. Rain had been a frequent visitor during the first half of December, but as the holy day of Christmas approached, snow showers took its place. In the early hours of the 17th, an earthquake shock had brought excitement to many across England and Wales, particularly those in the western counties. Yet, as more snow descended upon Bow Street, thoughts of this occurrence were far from Miss Georgina Dexter's mind. Sitting at a dilapidated table within the kitchen of the Bow Street Society's house, she hummed O Holy Night while threading twine for a packing needle's eye. Working in the light of a kerosene lamp, she sifted through laurel, ivy and mistletoe until she found a fresh curled holly leaf. This she speared with the packing needle's point before pushing the needle through and guiding the leaf along the twine to its knotted end. After adjusting the leaf's orientation, she delved into the mass of greenery to repeat the process. The tip of Miss Dexter's petite nose was red despite the stove's warmth at her back. Her usually light tone was also deeper, and every now and then she'd sniff and give a small cough. Nonetheless, her fair skin remained pink in its complexion, while her green eyes paid careful attention to her slender hands' work. Yellow lamplight danced over her forest green blouse and auburn hair. The former covered her entire bosom and matched her bustle skirts in colour, while the latter was wrapped into a large bun against the back of her neck. Tiny balls of light appeared and disappeared as the plain silver hair pins and brooch she wore caught the lamplight when she moved. Though aged 18, Miss Dexter's diminutive stature and proportions gave her the appearance of someone much younger. "That bow's up," Mr. Samuel Snyder's rough East End of London accented voice remarked from the doorway. Brown, beady eyes, warmed by the lifting of his rotund cheeks by his smile, met Miss Dexter's when she looked up. His larger-than-average hand was lifted with its thumb pointed over his shoulder. Unlike Miss Dexter, Mr. Snyder was broad in build and taller too. His own nose was perpetually reddened, while his complexion was coarse and dry. Even the thumb he held aloft was calloused and cracked. The sleeves of his off-white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, sweat droplets had formed in his black, bushy sideburns, and his short hair was more unkempt than usual. Patches of dust spotted his dark brown trousers and worn black leather boots. "I surrender," Miss Rebecca Trent declared from the table's other end. Putting the torn piece of brown paper she had been attempting to sew leaves onto down, she said, "I'm too heavy-handed for this." "I'm happy to finish it if you'd like," Miss Dexter replied with a smile. "Would you?" Miss Trent inquired. At Miss Dexter's nod, Miss Trent at once smiled and sighed, "Thank you." She put the materials before Miss Dexter and, standing, wiped her hands upon her apron. "To Mr. Snyder," she inquired, "you put the barrel round the handrail?" "Yeah," he replied. Taking a seat opposite Miss Dexter, he watched Miss Trent prepare some tea at the stove. In her late 20s, Miss Trent was younger than Mr. Snyder's 40-odd years. Attired in a burgundy jacket with matching bustle skirts, her clothes were far more ornamental compared to Miss Dexter's. The jacket's lapels were silk and framed a stark white blouse with 3 vertical lines of ruffles down its centre and a gold and ivory brooch pinned to its high neck. A broad black belt with brass buckles separated her jacket and skirts, the latter having a light burgundy front lace panel. The tight curls of her chestnut brown hair were pinned atop her head with a few loose strands permitted to hang down her back. Dark brown eyes looked to the snow-streaked window and bleak afternoon sky beyond as she remarked, "I suppose it doesn't matter how long it takes us to decorate the house, as long as it's done by Christmas Day." Pouring steaming water into a teapot, she added the last onto a tray with 3 cups and saucers, a jug of cream and a sugar bowl. "How shall you make merry on Christmas Day, Miss Trent?" Miss Dexter inquired as the Bow Street Society clerk joined them at the table. "My aunt has written inviting me to stay with her in Tunbridge," Miss Trent replied. "Which would be lovely for a day." She gave a weak smile. "I'm too accustomed to the unpredictable liveliness of London." "Family's still family, though," Mr. Snyder pointed out. "Some folks have got none." "Still, you're welcome to share Christmas Day with us, Miss Trent," Miss Dexter added. "Thank you," Miss Trent replied with a warmer smile. Setting the table with the tea things, she next picked up the pot and gave its contents a stir. Replacing it to stew a while, she remarked, "Christmas has snuck up on me this year, it seems." "Time's flown," Mr. Snyder said. Folding his large arms across his chest, he continued, "The London to Brighton run was back in November, but it feels like it was only yesterday," he smirked. "The weather was more dreary then." "I can imagine it being rather exciting," Miss Dexter remarked, her features lifted by her wide smile. Guiding another holly leaf along the twine, she laid her creation upon the table and, while holding it, leant forward with wistfulness in her eyes. "Seeing the horseless carriages and... what were the others, Sam?" "They called them motor cars," Mr. Snyder replied, and it was exciting, but very wet. Most drivers didn't have roofs. Mr. Snyder chuckled. No wonder only some got to Brighton. Still, he gave a nod. The start of the run was something to see. There's even talk of them doing it again next year. The sudden sound of hurried knocking interrupted Mr. Snyder, however. Though he and Miss Dexter looked toward the hallway, Miss Trent went to investigate. "The tea should be ready to pour now," she remarked before she left the room. Further knocking filled the hallway as she walked past the grand staircase and slid back the front door's numerous bolts. Yet, despite her making considerable noise, the knocks became frantic raps. "Oh, please open the door," a low voice cried from the other side. "I am," Miss Trent called back, turning the final key. When she opened the door, however, a willowy, gaunt woman stumbled inside with it. Catching her in her arms, Miss Trent felt the contours of the woman's skeleton through her clothes, comprised of a tattered midnight blue woolen shawl over a pale blue straight-line dress. The dress had a high neck and long narrowed sleeves. Her shawl's edges dripped melted snow onto Miss Trent's blouse, while small puddles formed beneath her heavy black booted feet. "Oh," the woman repeated, her voice mimicking her shivering. "Begging your pardon," she added as she straightened and surveyed the damp patch on Miss Trent's blouse. "Miss Trent?" the woman inquired, meeting Miss Trent's gaze with a look of trepidation in her own. She couldn't have been any older than 19, but her mouse-brown hair was streaked with grey. Her thin skin, stretched across angular cheekbones and sunken eye sockets, did her an equal disservice. "I am she," Miss Trent replied. She closed the door on the falling snow and, sliding a bolt into place, turned toward her visitor. "And you are—" "Mrs. Winifred Rowe." The woman came forward, her face contorted with desperation. "I know I'm not expected, Miss Trent, and I can't pay, but I must have the society's help if I'm to save us from the workhouse." "As much as I'd like to help, Mrs. Rowe, the Bow Street Society's funds aren't as buoyant as they ought to be. But it's Christmas!" Mrs. Rowe wailed, her voice drawing both Mr. Snyder and Miss Dexter from the kitchen. "Everything okay?" Mr. Snyder inquired, putting himself between Miss Dexter and the emotional visitor. "Yes, thank you, Sam," Miss Trent replied. To Mrs. Rowe she explained, "This is Mr. Samuel Snyder, a cabman, and Miss Georgina Dexter, an artist. They are both Bow Street Society members." She shifted her gaze back to those she'd introduced. "Mrs. Rowe is here to ask for the society's help. Miss Dexter, could you bring Mrs. Rowe and me some tea in the parlour?" "Of course," Miss Dexter replied with a meek nod. "Thank you," Miss Trent replied, and indicating the aforementioned room, told Mrs. Rowe, "There's a fire you may sit beside." Mrs. Rowe, though dejected, hurried toward the hearth's inviting glow seen through the parlour's open doorway. When she saw the plump blue sofa set before the fire, though, she hesitated. "Please sit," Miss Trent invited upon entering behind her. "I'd rather stand, thank you," came Mrs. Rowe's terse, yet nervous reply. "Very well," Miss Trent said, and took a seat upon an armchair facing the now closed door. Maintaining her calm composure, she continued, "As I'd begun to explain earlier, Mrs. Rowe, the society can't afford to gift monies, even at Christmas. Have you spoken to the parish?" "I'm not here to beg," Mrs. Rowe interrupted with wide eyes. Her grip tightened upon her shawl as she continued, "I want the society's help, the sort of help it's given others." She darted her eyes around the room and, shifting her weight between her feet, added, "Maybe I oughtn't to have come." "Mrs. Rowe," Miss Trent said as she stood. Mrs. Rowe's gaze snapped back to Miss Trent's. Please. Miss Trent began with a smile as she placed her hand upon Miss Rowe's arm and guided her to the sofa. Settle down by the fire and tell me what has happened to bring you here. Mrs. Rowe followed Miss Trent to the sofa but wavered as she looked upon its unblemished cushions. I wouldn't invite you to sit if I didn't want you to do so, Miss Trent said, her voice gentle as she witnessed her visitor's trepidation. Thank you, Mrs. Rowe whispered and sat on the sofa's edge. When the firelight warmed her face, the rigidity fell away from her lips and she bent forward a little. Miss Trent, who had returned to the armchair, watched her entranced visitor in silence. One by one, Mrs. Rowe's lean fingers regained their colour while a rosy tinge spread across her cheeks. The dampness of her shawl also waned, and for a time Mrs. Rowe enjoyed some comfort. Thank you, Miss Dexter, Miss Trent said as Miss Dexter carried in a tea tray following Mr. Snyder's opening of the door. You're welcome, Miss Dexter replied with a meek smile while placing the tray on a low table near Miss Trent. Miss Trent again thanked her and Miss Dexter left with a rustle of her skirts. How do you take your tea, Mrs. Rowe? Miss Trent inquired. Black, thank you, Winifred replied. Now, Miss Trent began after she had passed the cup across. Why have you come to the Bow Street Society today, Mrs. Rowe? Taking a sip of tea, Winifred felt its warmth soothe her nerves. All the same, she waited until she had replaced it upon its saucer before replying, I work at Brewer's Toy Makers in the Loafer Arcade. You know, in the Strand. Well, I did, until I was dismissed for... Her brow furrowed as she glanced toward the ceiling. Improper conduct, Mr. Brewer said. She looked back to Miss Trent and shook her head as she continued, But I never in all my years working at the shop done anything shameful. She straightened. I'm polite to the customers. She gave a nod. I smile when I ought. Another nod. And keep my mouth closed when I ought. I've never had a bad temper and I don't scare at the children when they touch the toys. Her shoulders slumped as she released a loud sigh. I told Mr. Brewer I'd not done what was being said of me, but he paid me no mind. He gave me my pay, on account of it being Christmas, and told me not to go back. She bowed her head. My Stephen's work don't pay too well, but we always made ends meet. We can't now, though. Putting her cup down, she reached for Miss Trent's arm and looked her square in the eyes. Please, Miss Trent. It's a lot to ask a person, but I ask it anyway. Not for me, but for my children. The work at Brewer's meant the difference between our home and the workhouse. I can't guarantee the society will be able to. Anything the Bow Street Society can do for us will be a blessing, Miss Trent. Anything. Mrs. Rowe released Miss Trent's arm and added, My Stephen's a sweep. He'll sweep your chimneys and won't ask for coin. That shan't be necessary, Miss Trent replied with a soft smile. Let me be certain we understand one another, however. You wish for the Bow Street Society to convince Mr. Brewer to re-employ you, correct? Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Rowe replied. The improper conduct you mentioned, Miss Trent said. What is it you are accused of exactly? Improper letters to a customer, Mrs. Rowe said. Leaning forward, she shook her head and insisted, But I never done anything of the kind, Miss Trent. I would never chance losing my work like that, or my Stephen. Lord knows I love him so. Very well, Miss Trent said after a few moments' consideration. The society accepts your case, Mrs. Rowe. Now, take some more tea and warm yourself by the fire until the snow passes. In the meantime, I will send word to some of our society members who will look into this matter for you. Thank you, Miss Trent, Mrs. Rowe cried, covering her mouth as tears erupted from her eyes. Her body trembled and her head shook. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Loafer Arcade, located between West Strand and Adelaide Street, was an impressive structure built, according to Routledge's Popular Guide to London circa 1873, in the Grecian style. Its interior comprised of a wide corridor lined with several narrow arches interrupted by higher, clear glass domes. Embossed carvings of flora decorated the corners of each ceiling, which curved to meet the dome's edges. The cubed pillars of the arches were embedded into the walls on each side, thus leaving but a few inches to jut outward. The spaces between pillars were occupied by the arcade's many shops, each with identical large flat-paned display windows. These windows, constructed from 9 individual panes and framed by 2 Grecian-style pillars, ended at the windows' tops. The doorways into the shops were on one side of these windows. Curved supports for glass sconces, which were similar in shape to a daffodil's trumpet, were mounted upon every other supporting pillar lining the arcade. At the arcade's end were 3 squared archways formed by 2 immense Grecian-style pillars supporting a wall containing 3 tall windows. London streets were beyond these open archways. In total, the Louvre Arcade was 245 feet long and, in December of 1896, was decorated with bells and wreaths of holly, laurel and ivy throughout. The arcade's toy makers had laid out their wares on stalls outside the respective shop windows. China dolls with painted cheeks, soft dolls stuffed with rags, boxes of wooden toy soldiers and marionettes were all on display. Majestic fir trees adorned with lit candles and carved angels lined the corridor, filling the cold air with their musky scent.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing ye dismay.
A choir of well-dressed ladies and top-hatted gentlemen sung as Lady Catherine Alston and Miss Agnes Webster passed on their way into the arcade. The shortest singer held a box for donations. With each penny or shilling deposited, she bowed her head and uttered, "God bless you." Such was her response when Lady Alston added £5 to the collection. In her late 40s, Lady Alston's fair complexion remained unblemished by sun or hardship. Though only 5 feet in height, the black court or Louis shoes she wore made her seem taller. Her warm, chestnut-brown hair was styled in tight curls which were, in turn, pinned against her head. A broad-brimmed, pale yellow straw hat sat squarely atop her head. Its flourish of white feathers, fresh holly leaves and berries, broad burgundy ribbon and green netting increased her height further. Wrapped around her slender, yet wide-shouldered form was a dark brown real fur coat. After depositing her donation, she slipped her black leather-clad hands back into her fur muff and entered the arcade. Miss Agnes Webster, who had gifted a few shillings, closed her umbrella and hooked its curved wooden handle onto the crook of her arm before following her employer. 20 years of age, Miss Webster's beauty was often described as underwhelming by many who knew her. Nonetheless, her broad, squared shoulders, perfect posture and hard scrutiny of her surroundings created an unignorably attractive air of strength. Her chocolate-coloured hair was plain, devoid of curls, and wrapped into a bun nestled against the base of her skull. Meanwhile, the right front side of her hair was covered by a narrow hat pinned at an unfashionable angle. In stark contrast to Lady Alston's, Miss Webster's attire comprised of a knee-length black cotton cloak over a loosely fitted cream blouse. This blouse sported the fashionable leg-of-mutton shape, tied on the lower arms, puffed out on the upper. A dark brown narrow brass-buckled belt accentuated her naturally narrow waist. Finally, she wore minimal bustle skirts which had burgundy panels on their front and dark brown pleated layers cascading down their back. An immense throng of people filled the arcade's corridor. Little girls tugged at the coats of their mothers and governesses while pointing at a doll. Little boys inspected the train sets. Babies slept soundly in their broad-wheeled carriages. Gentlemen discussed quality and price with the toy makers, and the ladies exchanged news of mutual friends. "Stay close and guard your purse, Agnes," Lady Alston remarked as they joined the masses. "Brewer's is along here on the left." "Yes, Lady Alston," Miss Webster replied, following her employer's hat since it was all she could see over the sea of heads. Every so often, someone would cut across her path, a child excited by the displays pulling along their governess, or a gentleman preoccupied with his pocket watch, forcing Miss Webster to stop or risk collision. It was at those times she was grateful for her employer's flamboyant taste in headwear, especially as the freelance journalist was in the habit of marching on ahead without ensuring her secretary kept pace. Shielding her eyes from the fir tree's candles as she passed, Miss Webster joined Lady Alston at the doorway of Brewer's Toy Makers. Following the example of his competitors, Mr. Brewer had set out a stall laden with brightly coloured trains, dolls, puppets, lanterns and dollhouses. Standing beside an oak-panelled counter at the shop's rear, Mr. Brewer's grey eyes surveyed his domain. Wiry, dark grey whiskers with off-white patches framed his aged features. Gold-rimmed, round spectacles perched upon the tip of his hooked nose. Beneath his full-frontal, pristine white apron was a black frock coat and trousers. A broad, black cravat, bookended by a shirt's starched white collar, peeked out from the apron's top. Male assistants tended the stall and counter, while 2 female employees boxed and gift-wrapped the purchased toys. Yet Lady Alston forewent any interaction with the workforce to approach the owner direct. "Mr. Brewer?" she inquired. "Yes?" the toy maker inquired in return. His voice was a deep baritone, while his eyes gazed upon Lady Alston with keen interest. "I am Lady Catherine Alston, a freelance journalist for the Truth and Women's Signal publications. This is my secretary, Miss Agnes Webster. In addition to our usual calling, we are members of the Bow Street Society, a former employee of yours." Lady Alston looked at Miss Webster. "Mrs. Winifred Rowe," Miss Webster stated. "Yes, Mrs. Winifred Rowe," Lady Alston repeated, adding to her secretary, "Thank you, Agnes. My memory's not what it was." Beaming at Mr. Brewer when she faced him again, she continued, "As I was saying, Mrs. Winifred Rowe came to the Bow Street Society in a terrible state. She claims you dismissed her for improper conduct, but having now met you, Mr. Brewer, I sense you are a kind and generous man, one who recognises a misunderstanding when he encounters it." "There's been no misunderstanding," Mr. Brewer stated as his genial expression hardened into a scowl. "Mrs. Rowe was caught sending a list of correspondence to one of my wealthiest and loyal customers." "How was she caught?" Miss Webster inquired, taking a small notebook and pencil from her satchel. "The customer complained, of course, after he had found the letter in a box containing the doll he'd purchased for his daughter," Mr. Brewer replied. "May we see the letter?" Miss Webster requested. Mr. Brewer looked between the 2 ladies. "It shan't do any good. My mind's been made." "Then our seeing it shan't cause any harm either," Lady Alston said. "I'm not aware of its location," Mr. Brewer admitted. "Please look anyway," Miss Webster said. The toy maker retained his scowl and, after a moment of stubborn inactivity, went behind the counter and rummaged through its drawers. All the while, his workforce moved around him to take customers' monies and gift-wrap their purchases. After several minutes, while Lady Alston and Miss Webster were bumped and nudged from all sides, Mr. Brewer turned for a single piece of paper. Passing it to Miss Webster, he said, "This is it." The paper's thickness at once told Miss Webster it was worth more than Mrs. Rowe could afford. Written in black ink was a simple question: "Why do you shun my affection?" The letter was unsigned. "Do you have this paper in your shop, Mr. Brewer?" Miss Webster inquired. "No," the toy maker replied. "It's expensive paper," Miss Webster remarked. "How did you come to have the letter?" "The customer returned it, with the doll and box the doll was packed in. Is that all?" "Not quite," Lady Alston smiled. "May we have the name?" "Absolutely not," Mr. Brewer barked. "I've said all I have to say. Goodbye." Turning toward the counter with a fiercer scowl than before, he stopped, looked over his shoulder at them and muttered, "And a Merry Christmas." When neither lady spoke, he added, "Will you not wish me the same?" "Not yet," Lady Alston replied, causing the toy maker's scowl to return. "So be it," he said, and walked away. "Come, Agnes," Lady Alston announced, and, slipping her hands into her muff, turned upon her heel and strode from the shop. "We must return to Bow Street and speak to Miss Trent about what is to be done. Excuse me," someone called from behind them. As both Lady Alston and Miss Webster looked back, one of the women who had been wrapping the toys approached. "Begging your pardons," she added when she'd reached them. "I didn't mean to hear what you said to Mr. Brewer, but as I was so close by, I couldn't help but overhear. Again, begging your pardons, but it's only right I tell you what I saw." "What did you see, Miss?" Lady Alston inquired. "Libby," the woman replied, pushing a strand of blonde hair behind her large ear. "Winnie putting the doll into the box and wrapping it up, but it's what I didn't see that I want to tell you about." Miss Libby sighed. "Begging your pardons again, ladies, but there wasn't a letter or anything in the box." "Have you told Mr. Brewer of this?" Lady Alston inquired. "I have, but he told me to stop meddling." "The customer who received the doll, May you give us his name? Miss Webster inquired. I don't think I ought to, Miss Libby replied with a glance back at the shop. It's the only way we can help Mrs. Rowe, Lady Elston urged. Mr. Brewer, though, Miss Libby said, her voice trailing off. Lady Elston and Miss Webster waited, however, and after some consideration, Miss Libby admitted, Lord Monaghan is his name. I know of Lord Monaghan, Lady Elston remarked in a dry tone. Have you served him during his visits? He don't usually come himself. A servant of his does, and buys the toys. Mr. Brewer don't approve of us girls speaking with the gentlemen, though, or handling the moneys, so neither Winnie nor me have ever talked to him. Miss Webster's brow quirked at Miss Libby referring to herself as a girl. She was in her early 20s at least. You said usually. Has he come in person recently? Lady Elston queried. A couple of days ago, Miss Libby replied. He came into the shop, spoke to Mr. Brewer, and then, Miss Webster pressed. He had a sort of funny turn, came over all white. He asked Mr. Brewer if any other women worked for him. Only Mrs. Rowe, Mr. Brewer told him. Lord Monaghan lost even more colour at that. Mr. Brewer asked if he was well, but he said he was. Then he went off like a rabbit from a hole. Does he often buy toys from Mr. Brewer? Lady Elston inquired. Yes, but the doll Winnie box was the first in weeks. Miss Libby shook her head and grimaced. The money he spent on that daughter of his, a fussy one she must be too. Why do you think that? Lady Elston queried. He never keeps a doll longer than a day. Not the first one he buys anyway. You can be sure his servant will be back the next morning with the doll all wrapped up in brown paper in its box. Not the hair colour the young mistress wants, he would say, or the dress is too plain. Who would take the return? Miss Webster inquired. Winnie did this last time. Before that it was Miss Key, God rest her soul. She was always first in after Mr. Brewer and last to leave. Thank you, Miss Libby, Lady Elston said, clasping her hands in her own. Mrs. Rowe and the Bow Street Society are most grateful for your help. I wish you a very Merry Christmas. Thank you. A very Merry Christmas to you too, Miss Libby replied, her face lifting into a smile. This is exceedingly inconvenient, Lord Monaghan remarked, and pressed his clenched fist to his lips as he gave a hard cough. You are fortunate I am a curious sort. He put his fingertips together and laid his elbows upon the broad arms of his chair. Sitting behind a wide, solid oak desk, he kept his gaze upon Lady Elston, despite Miss Webster sitting at her side. The prominence of his pale green eyes, long dark lashes, and rose-red lips made for a notable schism against his powerful build and husky voice. Your time is appreciated, your lordship, Lady Elston replied. Yes, yes. You wish to speak to me of brewers? More coughing followed. While it is regrettable she lost her employ, I can only tell you what I told him. The letter was beneath the doll when I opened the box. I was enraged by it, so I returned the doll and lodged a complaint. Was that the reason for your recent visit? Lady Elston inquired. A pause preceded Lord Monaghan's reply. I don't quite understand. You visited Brewer's toy shop after you had already returned the doll, Miss Webster explained. No, I don't quite understand how it's any of your business, Lord Monaghan retorted. We mean no offence, your lordship. The Bow Street Society is simply trying to assist Mrs. Rowe. She vehemently denies any wrongdoing, Lady Elston said. As I expected she would, Lord Monaghan replied, stifling yet another cough. Why? Miss Webster inquired. It's not an act of criminality. What has she to gain? Blast if I know, Lord Monaghan remarked with a weak smile. Clasping his hands upon the desk as he leaned forward, he added, What is done is done. Who were you looking for? Miss Webster inquired. When the lord remained silent, however, she explained, You asked after Mr. Brewer's employees. You became pale when you were told those in the shop were the only employees Mr. Brewer had, except Mrs. Rowe. It's time for you to leave, Lord Monaghan replied, his lowered voice vicious in its coarseness. Miss Webster straightened and turned her head to gauge her employee's reaction. Lady Elston had lifted her head to look upon the now standing lord. He said, Please, don't force my hand." "We're leaving," Lady Alston replied, and, keeping her gaze fixed to his, stood also. "I hope your daughter wasn't too disappointed when she didn't receive a replacement doll." "My daughter?" Lord Monaghan said, taken aback. "Yes, the one you purchased all those dolls for. You returned the last doll, Lord Monaghan, the one Mrs. Rowe packed, but you didn't get another," Lady Alston pointed out. While Miss Webster put away her things and joined her employer in standing, Lady Alston continued, "If Miss Kitty had taken receipt of your returned doll, you would have certainly been given a replacement." She paused. "Her passing away was a tragedy." The two Bow Streeters watched as the colour drained from Lord Monaghan's features. Nonetheless, neither his expression nor his stance altered. Instead, he was as still as the study in which they stood. Lady Alston's lips parted, her shoulders squared, and her head recoiled at his reaction. For a moment, the two just stared at one another. He with his quivering Adam's apple, and she with her held breath. Miss Webster, who had begun to leave, stopped and looked back at the freelance journalist. "Lady Alston?" "Lord Monaghan has requested we leave, Agnes," Lady Alston replied, downcast. She gave a small smile when she faced her, though. "Let us leave." "Yes, my lady," Miss Webster replied, and opened the study door. Lady Alston's next remark compelled her to pause in the doorway and look back for a second time, however. "I'm sorry, your lordship. Truly," she said. Lord Monaghan's head gave a slight bob. Without another word, he turned to the wall and dug his fingers into the firm leather of his chair's back. Miss Webster watched him lift his head towards the heavens, but before she could comment, Lady Alston had taken her arm and steered her away from the room. Hot tea warmed Mrs. Rowe's core as she once again sat before the fire in the Bow Street Society's parlour. Attired in drier clothes than her last visit, she admired the fresh holly wreath lining the mantel-shelf. More wreaths and sprigs of mistletoe hung around the room, while a fir tree dominated its back wall. The flames of almost 100 slender white candles illuminated its dark green foliage. Standing within shallow holders made of clay painted gold, these candles were prevented from falling by the clay ball suspended beneath them. This ball acted as a counterbalance to the top heavy weight of a melted wax candle. The balls were, in turn, painted various shades of red, green and gold. A string of small brass bells encircled the tree from top to bottom, the surfaces reflecting the dancing fire and candlelight. On the tree's summit was a carved star painted gold. A collection of smaller candles were placed in holders affixed to the branches below the star, thus illuminating it. The tree's base stood within a large clay pot weighed down with sand. The usually exposed oak floorboards beneath were covered by a blanket of cotton wool and ivy. Other additions to the parlour were a miniature stable scene on the mantel-shelf, a string of Christmas cards hung across the chimney breast, and a bowl of walnuts on the low table. Mrs. Rowe was pulled from her pleasant reverie by the sound of approaching footsteps. When she looked at the door as it opened, however, she was startled by the entrance of her former employer. She stood at once, her eyes wide and her heart racing as the cup she held rattled upon its saucer. Mr. Brewer," she said. Glancing at the spilt tea within the saucer, she put both down. I wasn't told of you being here," she added, smoothing her dress and tattered shawl with trembling hands. "Please be seated, Mrs. Rowe," Miss Trent said as she stepped around the toy maker to enter the parlour. "And you, Mr. Brewer?" "Mrs. Rowe," the toy maker acknowledged, without looking at her, as he walked past and took the offered armchair. "This is Lady Catherine Alston and her secretary, Mrs. Agnes Webster, Mrs. Rowe," Mrs. Trent introduced when the two Bow Streeters entered next. "I believe you've already met them, Mr. Brewer." "I have," Mr. Brewer replied. "Lady Alston and Miss Webster were assigned to your case, Mrs. Rowe," Miss Trent explained. Sitting on a dining chair in the space between the armchair and the sofa, the latter being where Mrs. Rowe sat, Miss Trent gestured for her associates to begin. "Mr. Brewer," Lady Alston began, walking forward. When she was certain she had the toy-maker's full attention, she continued, "Mrs. Rowe is not guilty of the moral crime laid at her door. I and Miss Webster are absolutely certain of it." "Oh, thank goodness!" Mrs. Rowe cried, her hand resting upon her chest. "How?" Mr. Brewer challenged. "The letter was found in the box of the doll she packed." "It was, but she didn't put it there," Miss Webster said. "Lord Monaghan did," Lady Alston added. Mr. Brewer's mouth fell open. "I beg your pardon?" "Another of your employees, Miss Libby, told us she had seen Mrs. Rowe box and wrap the doll bought by Lord Monaghan," Lady Alston explained. "Miss Libby said there wasn't a letter in the box, and we are inclined to believe her. Lord Monaghan put the letter in the box before he returned the doll to your shop." "I don't believe it," Mr. Brewer said, his tone and expression hard. "Why would he do such a scandalous thing?" Mr. Brewer turned sharp eyes to Mrs. Rowe and demanded, "What have you been doing in my shop?" "She hasn't done anything," Miss Webster interjected. When Brewer cast his scowl upon her, she went on, "The letter was intended for the late Miss Kitty, the lady who, according to Miss Libby, would receive Lord Monaghan's returned dolls." Both Mr. Brewer and Mrs. Rowe stared at the secretary. "You forbid any of your employees from speaking with the male customers or handling the moneys," Lady Alston said. "The exchange of letters was the only way Lord Monaghan would have been able to communicate with Miss Kitty without you knowing. Given his lordship's reaction to the news of Miss Kitty's death earlier, he had no knowledge of the fact. We can assume then his visit to your shop, Mr. Brewer, when he had his turn, was Lord Monaghan trying to find Miss Kitty." "But why return the doll? He could have given her the letter in the shop," Mrs. Rowe said, clutching and twisting her shawl's corners. "It could have been seen by Mr. Brewer," Miss Webster explained. "I think Lord Monaghan would purchase a doll, and Miss Kitty would place a letter in the box with it when she boxed and wrapped it. Then, when Lord Monaghan had written a reply, he would put it under the doll and return the toy with a request for a replacement. When she boxed and wrapped the replacement doll, Miss Kitty must have put her final reply with it. Lord Monaghan doesn't have a daughter," Lady Alston announced. "That much was made clear by his confusion when I asked after her." "What of his not buying anything for weeks?" Mr. Brewer inquired, looking between the two Bow Streeters. "He had rather a bad cough when we saw him," Lady Alston remarked. "He must have taken ill," Miss Webster interjected. "And he is admitted to all of this?" Mr. Brewer inquired. Lady Alston at once chuckled and with a slight wave of her hand replied, "Heavens, no! Such a scandal could ruin such a man's reputation, and the Bow Street Society is not in the habit of ruining anyone's name. Isn't that right, Miss Trent?" "It is," Miss Trent replied. "Lord Monaghan is a lovelorn gentleman who is now nursing a broken heart," Lady Alston resumed. "Besides, our concern was Mrs. Rowe and her predicament, a predicament that is now in your power to remedy, Mr. Brewer." "Aye," the toy-maker replied, and looking about the room realised all were looking at him. With a frown he cleared his throat and began, "I'm not entirely certain I can do—" "Mr. Brewer," Lady Alston interrupted, raising her voice to drown out Brewer's. Blinking, the toy-maker looked up at her. She resumed, "Need I remind you of the season? Mrs. Rowe is innocent. Christmas is not about toys or decorations, but goodwill to all men and women. Would you see a hard-working, innocent woman and her family in the workhouse at such a time?" Mr. Brewer shifted his gaze to the gaunt, tired face of his former employee. "Please, Mr. Brewer, I'll work hard and hold my tongue," Mrs. Rowe said. "No," Mr. Brewer replied. Mrs. Rowe's grip upon her shawl tightened. A ghost of a smile soon passed over the toy-maker's lips as he exorcised the scowl. Placing his hand upon the sofa's arm, he smiled. "You will be welcome back to Brewer's Toy-Makers with open arms. On Christmas Day, you and your family shall dine with me and mine. It's the very least I can do." "Oh, Mr. Brewer!" Mrs. Rowe cried, clapping her hand over her mouth to stifle a happy sob. Nevertheless, tears rolled from her eyes and her sobbing strengthened. "Thank you," she whispered. Swallowing back her emotion, she looked about the room before standing and going to each person in turn. "Lady Alston, Miss Webster," she sniffled, holding one of each lady's hands in her own. Giving them a small squeeze, she whispered, "God bless you." Releasing their hands, she turned to clasp Miss Trent's. "And you, Miss Trent, thank you for all you have done." She pulled away and turning toward them all added, "It truly is a Christmas miracle. God bless you all."
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing ye dismay. Remember Christ our Saviour was born on Christmas Day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy.